Welcome, dear listener. Welcome to another journey through the past, another exploration of a world so different from our own that it scarcely seems real. I'm delighted you've joined me tonight, or perhaps it's early morning where you are, or a lazy afternoon. Wherever you find yourself, whatever time has brought you to this moment, I'm glad you're here. Before we begin our journey backwards through time, I'll invite you to do something that helps this channel grow. If you find value in these long, meandering explorations of history, if you appreciate the way we take our time with the details others might rush past, consider subscribing. There's no pressure, of course, but it does help me continue making these videos for you. A simple click, and then we can move on to more important matters. Tonight we're going to explore a question that sounds simple, but contains multitudes. What if you woke up in Viking times? Not as a visitor, not as an observer with modern knowledge and sensibilities intact, but as someone who simply belonged there. What would your days be like? What would you see, smell, hear, taste and feel? What would horrify you? What might surprise you with its normalcy? Picture, if you will, opening your eyes one morning to discover that everything has changed. The bed beneath you is not your bed. The ceiling above is not your ceiling, and the life stretching before you is governed by rules and realities so foreign to our modern existence that they might as well be from another planet. This is where we're going tonight, into the lived experience of Norse life in the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD. We'll spend considerable time there together, you and I, exploring the mundane and the brutal, the surprisingly ordinary and the shockingly harsh. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's step through that doorway together and see what awaited anyone who called the Norse world home. The world we're entering tonight stretched across Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark, but also reached its fingers into Iceland, Greenland, the British Isles, and even, briefly, North America. We're focusing primarily on the Scandinavian homeland during the Viking Age, that 3-century span from roughly the late 8th century to the late 11th century. This was not a unified nation, but rather a patchwork of competing kingdoms, petty chiefdoms and independent settlements, each with its own variations in custom and law, though all sharing a common cultural and linguistic heritage. The geography itself shaped everything about Norse life. In Norway, settlements clung to fjords and coastal areas, hemmed in by mountains and forests. Sweden's landscape offered more agricultural land, particularly in the central plains, though the north remained wild and harsh. Denmark, with its more temperate climate and gentler terrain, supported larger populations and more intensive farming. But everywhere, the northern latitude meant long, dark winters and brief explosive summers, a rhythm that governed every aspect of existence. This was a pre-Christian world, though Christianity was beginning to creep in around the edges by the later Viking Age. The Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya and the rest, were not distant abstractions but active forces in daily life. Every natural phenomenon, every stroke of fortune or misfortune, reflected the will of the gods or the machinations of various spirits and supernatural beings that populated the Norse cosmos. The world was enchanted, alive with meaning and intention beyond the merely material. Technology was limited in ways we can hardly fathom. No electricity, obviously, no running water, no printing press, no mechanical tools beyond the most basic. Iron was precious, glass was rare. Most tools were wood and stone, leather and bone. Light came from fires and tallow lamps. Heat came from fires. Food preservation depended on salt, smoke and cold. Medicine was herbal remedies and hope. The entire technological apparatus that makes modern life possible simply did not exist. Population density was low compared to today, but don't imagine empty wilderness. By the Viking Age, Scandinavia had been inhabited for millennia. Settlements dotted the coasts and clustered in river valleys. Trade networks connected distant regions. But travel was difficult and dangerous. Most people lived their entire lives within a day's walk of where they were born. The world was simultaneously smaller, bounded by what you could reach on foot or by boat, and larger, full of unknown dangers and mysteries beyond the horizon. Norse society was organised around the household and the extended kinship network. Your family determined almost everything about your life, your social status, your occupation, your marriage prospects, your allies and enemies. Blood feuds could span generations. Kinship obligations were absolute. To be without family was to be vulnerable in ways we can scarcely imagine, stripped of the primary social safety net in a world with no others. The social hierarchy was rigid but not entirely impermeable. At the top were the jarls, nobles who controlled land and commanded fighting men. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned their own land or paid rent to work another's. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves, property of their owners, with no legal rights and no hope of protection under law. You could be born into any of these classes, and while movement between them was possible, it was rare and difficult. Violence was endemic to this society in ways that modern people, even those familiar with crime and war, struggle to comprehend. Raiding was an accepted means of gaining wealth and honour. Personal disputes were often settled through combat. The legal system, such as it was, recognised a man's right to seek vengeance for wrongs done to him or his family. Peace was maintained not through any centralised authority, but through a complex web of obligations, alliances, and the threat of retaliation. To appear weak was to invite attack. Women's roles were more complex than popular imagination suggests. While Norse society was patriarchal, and women held less formal power than men, they also enjoyed certain rights and freedoms unusual for medieval Europe. A woman could own property, inherit land, divorce her husband under certain circumstances. She managed the household in her husband's absence, which, given the Norse propensity for long trading voyages and raiding expeditions, meant she often wielded considerable practical authority. Yet she was also subject to male authority in ways both legal and cultural. Her worth often measured in terms of the alliances her marriage could forge or the sons she could bear. Religion permeated everything, but it was a religion fundamentally different from modern faiths. There was no church, no scripture, no single path to salvation. The gods were powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not all-knowing. They could be bargained with, honoured through sacrifice, persuaded to grant favour. Fate, word in Old Norse, was inescapable. Your destiny was woven by the Norns at your birth, and while you could face it with courage or cowardice, with honour or shame, you could not avoid it. This fatalism gave the Norse their reputation for fearlessness in battle, but it also created a profound underlying anxiety, a sense that disaster was always just one wrong turn away. So what would it actually be like to live in this world? Not the romanticised version of Viking life presented in media, all noble warriors and adventurous exploration, but the real, daily, grinding experience of existence in early medieval Scandinavia. That's what we're here to explore tonight. The texture of a life so different from ours that even imagining it requires an act of radical empathy and imagination. We'll examine the physical environment first, what you'd experience through your senses the moment you woke up in a Norse dwelling. Then we'll move through the practical realities of daily survival. Food, water, shelter, clothing, labour. From there, we'll explore the psychological and social dimensions of Norse life, the relationships and hierarchies that structured human interaction. We'll confront death and religion, those fundamental human concerns that every society must address. We'll examine inequality and power, who had them and who didn't. And finally, we'll look at what happened when things went wrong, when the already harsh baseline of Norse existence gave way to something even worse. This will take time. We're not rushing. That's rather the point. We're going to sit with these realities, let them unfold in detail, consider them from multiple angles. Some of what we discuss will be disturbing. Violence, slavery, death, suffering. But we'll approach it all calmly, matter-of-factly, remembering that this was simply how life was for millions of people across 3 centuries. They didn't choose to be born into this world. They simply made the best of the hand they were dealt, found meaning and joy where they could, endured what they had to endure. So let us begin at the beginning, with the first thing you'd experience if you woke up in Viking times, the physical space around you, and just how profoundly different it would be from anything in your current life. The first thing you'd notice before you even opened your eyes fully would be that you were not alone. The longhouse, that distinctive Scandinavian dwelling that might house anywhere from a single extended family to dozens of people, offered no privacy as we understand it. You'd wake to the sounds of other people breathing, snoring, coughing, moving about in the darkness. The structure itself might be anywhere from 50 to 100 feet long, depending on the wealth and status of its owners, but that space was shared among everyone who belonged to the household. Picture, if you will, lying on a raised platform along the long walls of the structure, packed in with other bodies for warmth. The centre of the longhouse was dominated by one or more long fire pits, perhaps still smouldering from the night before, perhaps already being rekindled by whoever was assigned that duty. The walls were wood or turf, depending on what materials were available locally. The roof was thatched, though in some regions turf roofs were common. Support posts marched down the length of the building, carved with patterns that might be decorative, might be religious, might be both. The floor was packed earth, covered with straw or rushes that would be changed. Well, not as often as you'd like. There were no windows as we'd recognise them, perhaps small openings high in the walls to let smoke escape and a bit of light in, but mostly the longhouse was dark. During winter it would be dark most of the time anyway, given the northern latitude. You'd spend much of your life in dimness, lit by flickering firelight that cast long shadows and never quite illuminated anything properly. Your eyes would adjust, of course. Humans are adaptable, but the darkness would be a constant presence, a fact of life you'd never escape. In one corner you might see the family's most precious possessions stored in chests, weapons, jewellery, fine cloth, anything too valuable to risk leaving unguarded. In another, tools and equipment leaned against walls. Livestock might occupy one end of the longhouse during winter, separated from the human quarters by a partition but still present, contributing their warmth and their smell to the communal atmosphere. This was efficient, practical, and utterly unlike anything most modern people have experienced. As you lay there in those first moments of consciousness, you might notice how your body ached from sleeping on a surface that was only marginally softer than the ground itself. Your bedding would be wool blankets, perhaps stuffed with straw, or feathers if you were fortunate, laid over wood platforms, comfortable by the standards of the age, but those standards were low. We can scarcely imagine how chronic discomfort shaped consciousness itself, how the constant low-level physical hardship coloured every thought and feeling. Before we go any further, we need to address something that historical accounts rarely dwell on, but that would have been inescapable in Norse life: the smell. The moment you woke in that longhouse, you'd be enveloped in a complex, powerful odour that would shock anyone accustomed to modern hygiene standards. This isn't meant to be gratuitous or crude, it's simply a fact that must be acknowledged if we're to understand what life was actually like. The smell would be a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal dung, stale food, mildew, and the particular mustiness of wool that's been worn for weeks without washing. In winter, when the longhouse was sealed against the cold and dozens of people spent most of their time indoors, the smell would intensify to levels that would probably make a modern person gag. The rushes on the floor absorbed various liquids: spilled food, urine from chamber pots that missed their mark or weren't emptied promptly, water tracked in from outside. They'd become sodden and rank before being replaced. The Norse did bathe, contrary to some medieval European societies. They valued cleanliness more than many of their contemporaries, and bathing was part of their routine when possible. But when possible was the operative phrase. In deep winter, heating enough water for a full bath was a significant expenditure of resources. Quick washes were more common. Clothing wasn't laundered frequently. Water had to be carried, heated, and the process of washing wool by hand was labour intensive. Most people owned very few changes of clothing anyway. What made this truly brutal was that you couldn't escape it. There was nowhere to go that smelled fresh and clean. Even outside, settlements had their own distinctive odours. Livestock, middens where trash and waste accumulated, smoke from cooking fires, the smell of fish drying or meat smoking. Your nose would adjust, of course. After a while, you'd stop noticing most of it. But imagine those first days, that first week, when your modern sensibilities would be under constant assault from smells that signalled to your brain that something was wrong, unsanitary, dangerous. The Norse themselves would have found modern people's obsession with being odourless somewhat baffling. Smell was information about the weather, about the season, about what was cooking, about who was sick, about 1,000 daily details. But it was also a constant reminder of how close you lived to dirt and decay, how thin the margin was between order and filth, between the carefully maintained human space and the natural world that was always threatening to reclaim it. Consider for a moment how smell shapes memory and emotion, how the right scent can transport you instantly to another time and place. If you woke up in Viking times, the smell alone would reinforce every single moment that you were no longer in your world. You couldn't forget, couldn't pretend, couldn't find a sanitised modern refuge. The smell of Norse life would be in your hair, your clothes, your nostrils, inescapable. Once your olfactory senses finished reeling, you'd become aware of the soundscape of Norse life, and crucially you'd realise it never truly stopped. Even in the dead of night, the longhouse was alive with noise. People snoring, coughing, tossing in their sleep, babies crying, someone rising to tend the fire or relieve themselves, the wind outside whistling through gaps in the walls, timber creaking as it contracted in the cold, animals stirring if they were housed in the building with you. During the day, the sounds would intensify, the constant murmur of conversation, since there was no such thing as going to another room for privacy, the rhythmic sounds of work, spinning wheels, looms clacking, knives chopping, tools being sharpened, children playing or fighting or crying, dogs barking, the crackle and pop of the fire, the scrape of spoons on bowls, the smack of lips, the slurp of drink. All of this in the echoing acoustic of a large wooden structure, sounds bouncing off surfaces and mixing together into a wall of human noise. Outside was hardly better. A Viking settlement was a working community, and work was loud. The ring of hammer on anvil from the smith, axes biting into wood, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep and goats, the grunts of pigs, the squawk of chickens, men calling to each other across the distance, the splash of oars if you were near water, the creak of ropes and rigging on boats, the rumble of cartwheels on rough paths, the sounds of construction and repair, which never truly ended because maintenance of structures and tools was constant. Perhaps most disturbing of all would be the sounds of violence, which would be far more present than in most modern lives. The thud of fists on flesh during a fight, the crack of a stick on a thrall's back, the screams of animals being slaughtered. If you witnessed a proper fight with weapons, the clash of metal, the terrible sounds that bodies make when they're being damaged. These weren't rare, shocking events. They were part of the normal soundscape of life. Violence was common enough that its sounds would become, not comfortable exactly, but familiar. But there was one sound that would be notably absent, and its absence would be profound. Silence. True silence. The kind you might experience in a modern home late at night, or in a quiet room, or with noise-cancelling headphones. That simply didn't exist in Norse life. You were never not hearing something. The human nervous system is not designed for constant auditory input, and the lack of silence probably had psychological effects that went unrecognised, because everyone shared the condition. So the next time you're lying in a quiet room, appreciating the stillness, remember that such stillness is a modern luxury. In Viking times, you'd be immersed in sound from the moment you woke until the moment you fell asleep, and even then the sounds would continue. Your brain would never truly rest. We can scarcely imagine how that constant stimulation shaped thought itself, attention itself, the very texture of consciousness. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves its own exploration. The darkness that would dominate your life if you woke up in Viking times. Not the darkness of a room at night that you can dispel with a light switch, but profound, inescapable darkness that was simply a fact of existence for much of the year in Scandinavia's high latitudes. In summer, the problem was reversed. The sun barely set, and sleep became difficult when daylight persisted almost around the clock. But winter was another matter entirely. At latitudes like Oslo, roughly 60 degrees, or Uppsala, roughly 60 degrees, winter days might offer only 5 or 6 hours of weak daylight. Further north, the polar night could mean weeks without the sun rising above the horizon at all. Even at midday in deep winter, the light was dim, slanting, barely adequate for work that required precision. Inside the longhouse, darkness was even more complete. The small smoke holes and occasional openings let in little light. The fire helped, but firelight is not daylight. It illuminates only what's close to it, leaves most of the space in shadow, and flickers constantly in a way that makes it hard to focus on detailed work. Tallow lamps and candles existed but were expensive, the rendered fat of animals being too valuable to burn for light unless absolutely necessary. Most activities had to be carefully scheduled around the available daylight hours. This meant that for much of the winter, you'd wake in darkness, perhaps work by firelight for a few hours, have a brief window of actual daylight, and then descend back into darkness for the long evening and night. The psychological effects of this would be significant. Seasonal affective disorder was probably common, though of course the Norse had no name for it, and no treatment beyond simply enduring. Depression, irritability, lethargy, all of this would intensify during the dark months. The darkness also created practical problems. Moving around at night was genuinely dangerous. You might trip over objects, walk into things, injure yourself in ways that could be serious given the limited medical care available. Fire was always a risk in structures made of wood and thatch, and in darkness that risk increased. Wild animals and human enemies could approach under cover of darkness. Sleep itself became problematic when your circadian rhythms were constantly disrupted by the extreme seasonal variation in daylight. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how the darkness isolated you. During long winter nights, you were effectively trapped in the longhouse with the same people day after day, week after week. You couldn't see to travel. You couldn't see to work outdoors. The world contracted to the circle of firelight, and beyond that circle lay in darkness that felt eternal. It's hard not to imagine how this shaped the Norse character, the emphasis on endurance, the tendency toward gloom and fatalism, the way their mythology dwelt so much on the long winter of Fimbul winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. The cold of Viking Age Scandinavia was not the cold of a modern winter where you can retreat to a heated home and adjust a thermostat. It was a cold that penetrated everything, that required constant effort to merely mitigate, that killed people regularly despite everyone's best efforts. If you woke up in Viking times, the cold would be one of your primary antagonists, something you'd think about and struggle against for much of the year. The longhouse provided shelter from wind and precipitation, which was significant, but it was heated only by the central fire, and that heat rose and dissipated quickly in a structure with gaps in the walls and roof. The areas near the fire might be reasonably warm, but the further you got from it, the colder it became. People slept near the fire when possible, but in a communal structure, not everyone could be equally close. Some would be warmer than others, and that difference could be the difference between comfort and genuine suffering. Your clothing would be all wool and leather, which are excellent insulators when dry but lose their effectiveness when wet, and they were wet more often than you'd like. From snow, from rain, from sweat, from the general dampness of northern winters. You'd layer garments, and the wealthy might have furs, but you'd never quite feel warm enough. The cold would seep in at your extremities, your fingers and toes always on the edge of numbness. Chilblains were common, that painful inflammation of the skin caused by exposure to the cold and moisture. What made this truly brutal was the exhaustion of it. Your body burns more calories trying to maintain its core temperature in cold conditions. You'd be constantly hungry, and food, while available, wasn't unlimited. The work of staying warm, gathering wood, maintaining the fire, preparing hot food and drinks was itself exhausting. In winter, you'd go to bed tired and wake up tired, never quite catching up on the energy debt your body was accruing. The cold also affected everything practical. Water froze, milk froze. Any liquid left unattended would solidify. Metal became brittle. Leather became stiff. Your breath frosted in the air, even inside. Getting out of your warm bedding in the morning required genuine willpower, because you knew you were about to be thoroughly uncomfortable for the next several minutes until you got near the fire. Bathroom needs became ordeals. Exposing yourself to the cold to urinate or defecate, then struggling to get your clothing back in place with numb fingers. Consider for a moment how the constant cold would affect your psychology. There's evidence that chronic cold exposure correlates with certain personality traits, stoicism, reduced emotional expressiveness, a kind of resigned pragmatism. Whether this is cultural or physiological or both is debatable, but the Norse was certainly known for these traits. When you're cold all the time, you perhaps have less energy for emotional display. You conserve everything, even warmth of feeling. It reminds us that human psychology is not separate from physical conditions but intimately shaped by them. Let's return to that platform bed we mentioned earlier, because it's worth understanding in detail what sleep would actually be like in Viking times. Sleep is such a fundamental part of human life, and the quality of your sleep affects everything else. So this matters more than you might initially think. If you woke up in Viking times, your nights would be profoundly different from what you're accustomed to. The sleeping platform was typically a raised wooden frame along the walls of the longhouse, elevated to put you above the coldest air, which settled near the floor, and above any water or dirt that might be down there. On this frame you'd have straw, or perhaps, if you were fortunate, a wool-stuffed mattress. This was laid directly on the wood. Over you, wool blankets, and in winter, perhaps sheepskins or other furs if the household could afford them. You'd sleep in your underlayers of clothing, not naked because you needed the extra warmth. You'd share this sleeping space with others. Privacy was not a concept that applied to sleep. Family members slept together, children packed in like cordwood, adults side by side. In larger households, people who weren't even related might share sleeping platforms. This was partly for warmth. Bodies generate heat, and in winter every bit helped, and partly because space was limited and valuable. The idea of everyone having their own bed, let alone their own room, would have been not just extravagant but incomprehensible. The intimacy this forced was both comforting and oppressive. You'd fall asleep to the sounds of others breathing, wake in the night to someone stirring beside you or climbing over you to get up. Any illness was immediately shared. If one person caught something, everyone in close quarters likely would too. Vermin were another issue. Lice, fleas, bedbugs. They thrived in these conditions, and no amount of cleaning could entirely eliminate them. You'd spend part of every day dealing with itching, scratching, picking parasites from your clothing and bedding. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how vulnerable you were while sleeping. Oh, within your own household among kin, you were probably safe enough. But if you were low status, if you were a thrall, if you were staying in someone else's household as a guest or visitor, sleep became a time of danger. You couldn't lock a door, you couldn't secure yourself in a private room. You were simply lying there, unconscious, surrounded by people who might mean you harm. Sexual assault must have been a constant threat, especially for women and children, especially for those without powerful protectors. The historical record is mostly silent on this. Such crimes weren't considered worth recording, but common sense suggests they were far from rare. So the next time you climb into your private comfortable bed, in your own room with a door that locks, consider what a luxury that is. In Viking times, sleep was not the peaceful refuge we tried to make it. It was just another time of vulnerability and endurance, another aspect of life where you made do with less than ideal conditions because there was no alternative. Now that we've established the basic physical environment, let's turn to a fundamental question of survival: food. What would you actually eat if you woke up in Viking times? The answer is a much narrower range of foods than you are accustomed to, prepared in ways that would seem strange, often preserved to the point of being barely recognisable as what they originally were. The basis of the Norse diet was grains, primarily barley, but also oats and rye. These would be ground into flour and made into flatbreads or porridge. Bread wasn't the risen, fluffy loaves we know, but dense, heavy rounds that could be hard enough to hurt your teeth if they'd gone stale. Porridge was probably more common, a thick gruel that could stretch to feed many mouths and could absorb whatever else you had to add flavour or nutrition. Bits of meat, fish, vegetables when available. Meat came when animals could be spared for slaughter, which wasn't daily. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, all were valuable for what they provided while alive. Milk, wool, work, so they weren't casually killed. When meat was available, it was preserved through salting, smoking or drying, processes that dramatically altered its texture and flavour. Dried fish was a staple, preserved cod that became hard as wood and had to be soaked and pounded before it was edible. The taste would be intense, salty, nothing like fresh fish. Dairy products were crucial. Milk, of course, though fresh milk didn't keep long. More commonly you'd consume it as skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, butter or cheese. These fermentation and preservation techniques extended the usability of milk and also created strong, distinctive flavours. Modern palates might find them overwhelming, but they were familiar to the Norse. Whey, left over from cheesemaking, was also consumed, often fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink. What made this truly brutal was the monotony. You'd eat the same things day after day, week after week, season after season. There were no spices to speak of, no sugar except honey, which was rare and precious, no variety to look forward to. Winter diet was especially grim. Preserved foods, root vegetables stored from harvest, whatever you'd manage to put by. Fresh fruits and vegetables existed only in summer. Vitamin deficiencies were common, manifesting in various health problems that people simply endured because they had no concept of vitamins or how to address these deficiencies. The quality of food also varied dramatically based on your status. The wealthy ate better cuts of meat more often, had access to imported luxuries like nuts or dried fruits, could afford to slaughter animals more freely. The poor and thralls ate the cheapest, coarsest foods, the parts of animals no one else wanted, the damaged or mouldy grains, the scraps. Hunger was a constant companion for many, not acute starvation necessarily, but a persistent gnawing emptiness that never quite went away. So the next time you open a well-stocked refrigerator and complain there's nothing to eat, remember that you have more variety in one day than most Norse people saw in a month. The range of flavours, textures and nutritional options available to even the poorest modern person exceeds what kings could access in Viking times. This reminds us that abundance is a historical anomaly, and for most of human existence, eating was about survival, not pleasure. Water is so easy to access in modern life that we rarely think about it. Turn a tap and clean water appears. But if you woke up in Viking times, obtaining water would be a daily labour-intensive task that was never quite finished. This seems like a small thing, but the cumulative effort and its implications for health and hygiene were significant. The source of water depended on where you were. If you were fortunate, the settlement was near a river, stream, or spring. Someone, often women or thralls, would have to walk to this source, fill heavy containers, wooden buckets, leather bags, ceramic vessels, and carry them back. Water is shockingly heavy. A gallon weighs about 8 pounds, and you'd need many gallons per day for a household, for drinking, cooking, washing, animals. This meant multiple trips, every day, in all weather. If you weren't near running water, you relied on wells. Digging and maintaining a well was significant work, and the water you drew from it might be clean, or might be contaminated depending on what was seeping into the groundwater. Waste from middens, animal manure, decaying organic matter. People didn't understand waterborne diseases, so they couldn't really assess whether a well was safe. They'd know to avoid water that looked or smelled obviously bad, but clear water could still make you sick. In winter, everything became harder. Water sources froze. You'd have to break through ice to get to water, or melt snow and ice, which required fire and fuel and time. The water you finally obtained might be cold enough to hurt your teeth. Keeping water from freezing indoors was another challenge. You'd keep vessels near the fire, but if the fire died down overnight, your water would freeze solid. What made this truly brutal was how it limited hygiene. When water is difficult to obtain, you use it sparingly. Washing yourself fully was a luxury reserved for when you could spare the water and fuel to heat it. Washing clothes was a rare, labour-intensive undertaking. Most of the time you made do with minimal washing, which circles back to why everyone smelled and why vermin were such a problem. Lack of clean water also affected food preparation and medicine. You couldn't rinse things properly, couldn't clean wounds adequately, couldn't maintain the level of cleanliness we know is important for health. The water itself, even when you got it, wasn't always pleasant to drink. It might be murky, might taste of minerals or earth, might contain things you'd rather not think about. People often preferred to drink ale or mead instead, partly for the alcohol and partly because the brewing process killed some of the dangerous microorganisms. But ale wasn't available in unlimited quantities, so you'd be drinking questionable water more often than you'd like. It's hard not to marvel at how much modern plumbing has changed human life. The ability to access clean water without effort, to use as much as you need without worrying about carrying it or heating it, to trust that it won't make you sick. This is a revolution that touches every aspect of existence. We can scarcely imagine returning to a world where water was a daily challenge. This is perhaps the aspect of Viking life that modern people would find most difficult to adapt to, so let's address it directly. What happened when you needed to urinate or defecate? The bathroom situation in Norse society was primitive in ways that would shock anyone accustomed to modern sanitation, and the implications for health and comfort were profound. There were no toilets, no sewage systems, no toilet paper. Instead, there were several unpleasant options. Inside the longhouse, you might have a chamber pot, a wooden or ceramic container that you'd use and then have to empty. This was typically used at night or when weather made going outside undesirable. The contents would be dumped in a midden heap or pit at some distance from the dwelling, though some distance might not be very far if space was limited. The smell of these waste pits would be another layer in the olfactory tapestry of Viking life. More commonly, you'd simply go outside to a designated area. Privacy was minimal. Perhaps a small structure or enclosure if you were in a wealthy household, but more likely just a spot at the edge of the settlement. You'd squat, do your business, and clean yourself with whatever was available. Leaves, moss, handfuls of hay or straw, or simply nothing at all. Cleanliness standards were obviously quite different. In winter, this became an ordeal. Imagine having to go outside in the dark, in the freezing cold, possibly in a snowstorm, pull up your layers of clothing, expose yourself to the elements, squat in the snow, and then somehow clean yourself with numb fingers before getting your clothing back in place. People must have delayed these needs as long as possible, which has its own health consequences. Urinary tract infections, constipation from holding it too long, hemorrhoids from straining, all of these would have been common. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the lack of hygiene afterward. You couldn't wash your hands with soap and warm water, Maybe you'd rinse them with cold water if it was available and you bothered, but many times you wouldn't. Then you'd go back to handling food, touching others, going about your day. The spread of disease through fecal-oral contamination must have been constant. Intestinal parasites were nearly universal. Infections and illness that we can now prevent with basic sanitation were simply accepted as part of life. The psychological aspect shouldn't be underestimated either. The vulnerability of it, especially for women who might be at risk when isolated. The indignity of having so little privacy for such a private function. The constant low-level discomfort and self-consciousness about one's body and its functions. Modern indoor plumbing grants us not just sanitation but dignity, and the lack of it would be degrading in ways that would wear on you day after day. So the next time you sit on a clean toilet in a warm private bathroom with toilet paper and running water, take a moment to appreciate what you're experiencing. This is not a trivial luxury. It represents a dramatic improvement in human dignity and health that would have been unimaginable to people of the past. We can scarcely overstate how much this one aspect of modern life would be missed if you found yourself in Viking times. The process of getting dressed in Viking times was more complicated and time-consuming than you might imagine, and the clothing itself was so different from modern garments that it's worth examining in detail. If you woke up in Viking times, you'd likely sleep in your undergarments, so getting dressed meant adding the outer layers that had been removed for sleep, or that needed adjustment. For men, the basic outfit consisted of a tunic, a long shirt that hung to about mid-thigh, worn over linen or wool trousers. These weren't tailored pants, but more like wrapped leggings that tied, or were held up with straps. Over the tunic you might wear a cloak in cold weather, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. Shoes or boots completed the outfit, made of leather, relatively simple in construction, and worn out quickly given the rough terrain and constant use. For women, the foundation was a long linen shift that served as undergarment. Over this came a wool dress, typically a long tunic. The distinctive overdress, the hangarock, was fastened at the shoulders with 2 tortoise brooches and draped over the underdress. This created the layered look we see in archaeological reconstructions. Like men, women wore cloaks for warmth, also pinned at the shoulder. Women's clothing was generally more complex, with more pieces to put on and fasten correctly. The fastening systems were fiddly. Brooches and pins instead of buttons or zippers, ties and laces instead of elastic. Everything had to be secured properly or it would come loose during the day. In cold weather with numb fingers, getting dressed was genuinely difficult. The garments were also heavy. Multiple layers of thick wool added considerable weight. You'd feel encumbered in ways modern clothing doesn't create. What made this truly brutal was how infrequently clothing was washed and how few changes you'd own. Most people had perhaps 2 sets of clothes, one to wear while the other was being mended or rarely washed. You'd wear the same garments day after day, week after week. They'd become stiff with dirt and sweat, would smell, would be stained. Rich people had more clothes and could change more often, but even they didn't approach modern standards. The constant physical contact with dirty fabric would be irritating, and the awareness of your own filth would be humiliating. Clothing also signified status in ways that were immediately readable. The quality of fabric, the presence of decorative elements, the condition of garments, all of this told others where you stood in the social hierarchy. If you were a thrall, your clothes would be the cheapest, roughest wool, probably ill-fitting, definitely stained and patched. You'd know, and everyone else would know, that you were at the bottom. It's hard not to feel how that daily reminder of the low status would weigh on a person's sense of self. Let's talk about work, because if you woke up in Viking times, work would dominate your waking hours in a way that's hard for modern people to conceptualise. The baseline of labour required just to maintain existence was enormous, and there was no end to it. No weekend, no retirement, no real rest except in old age or illness, and even then you'd work as much as you physically could. If you were a free farmer, a carl, your days would be filled with agricultural labour in the growing season. Ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting. all done by hand or with simple tools and draft animals. The work was back-breaking, the hours long, the pace relentless. In winter, there was animal care, tool repair, wood cutting, and preparation for next season. You'd also spend time on maintenance, fixing the roof, repairing fences, mending equipment. Nothing stayed fixed. Everything deteriorated constantly and had to be maintained. For women, the labour was equally relentless but different in nature. Food preparation was a constant task. Grinding grain, baking bread, cooking meals, preserving food for winter. Textile production was perhaps the most time-consuming. Processing raw wool or flax, spinning it into thread, dyeing the thread, weaving fabric, sewing garments, mending worn clothing. A single garment might represent hundreds of hours of work. Add to this childcare, cleaning, dairy work, gardening, herb gathering, and the numerous other tasks that fell to women, and you have a workload that never ended. If you were a thrall, your work was whatever your owner commanded, and it was typically the hardest, dirtiest jobs. Heavy manual labour, mucking out stables, hauling water, cutting wood, processing waste, slaughtering animals. You worked until you were told to stop, received minimal compensation, shelter and basic food, and had no say in what you did or how long you worked. The exhaustion would be profound, the indignity constant. What made this truly brutal was the absence of any real leisure. Yes, there were festivals and feast days, moments when the community gathered and work paused, but these were rare. Most days were work from dawn until dark, and in winter, when darkness came early, you'd work by firelight if there was work that could be done. Children started working as soon as they were able, taking on simple tasks and gradually graduating to more complex labour. The elderly worked until they physically couldn't anymore. The psychological weight of this endless labour shouldn't be underestimated. There was no finish line, no goal beyond survival, no accumulation that would eventually allow you to stop. You worked, and then you worked more, and then you died. The rare moments of joy and celebration stood out precisely because they interrupted this grinding routine. It's hard not to wonder how this shaped consciousness itself, how the certainty of endless toil affected hope, ambition, and imagination. We've mentioned fire several times, but it deserves its own discussion because maintaining fire was a constant, critical task that modern people take entirely for granted. If you woke up in Viking times, fire would be something you thought about constantly, because without it, you'd be cold, hungry, and in darkness. And unlike flicking a lighter or turning on a stove, maintaining fire in the Viking Age required effort and attention. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult. The most common method was striking steel against flint to create sparks, which you direct onto carefully prepared tinder, dry moss, fungus, or finely shredded plant material. Getting those sparks to catch required skill and patience, especially if the tinder was even slightly damp. Once you had a small ember, you'd carefully nurture it, blowing gently to provide oxygen, adding progressively larger pieces of kindling until you had actual flame. This could take many minutes, and in cold or wet conditions it might be nearly impossible. For this reason, fires were kept burning as continuously as possible. Someone had to be responsible for maintaining them, adding fuel, making sure they didn't die out. At night, fires would be banked, partially smothered so they'd burn slowly through the dark hours and could be revived in the morning. But sometimes, despite best efforts, fires went out. Then you had either the laborious process of starting anew, or the humiliating task of going to a neighbour to beg a coal or burning brand to restart your own fire. The fuel for fires was another constant concern. Wood had to be cut, hauled, split and dried, a never-ending task. In areas where wood was scarce, people burned peat, compressed plant material dug from bogs, or even dried dung. The quality of fuel affected the quality of fire. Some woods burned hot and clean, others smoked terribly or burned quickly without providing much heat. Managing your fuel supply was a strategic question that had to be constantly considered. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how dangerous fire was. In structures made of wood and thatch, a fire that got out of control could destroy everything in minutes. People were burned, sometimes fatally. Children fell into fires. Sparks escaped and ignited bedding or clothing. The longhouse design with its central fire pit meant you were always near open flame, always at risk. You had to develop a constant awareness, a watchfulness, because one moment of inattention could lead to disaster. The relationship with fire shaped daily life in ways we can barely comprehend. Fire was life, warmth, light, cooked food, protection. But it was also dangerous, demanding, a hungry thing that had to be fed and watched. You couldn't ignore it. It was always there, a presence as constant as your own breathing. So the next time you adjust your thermostat or turn on your stove with a simple click, remember that this ease is a recent development. For most of human history, fire required constant labour and vigilance. Now we need to discuss something darker, the violence that was woven into the fabric of everyday life in Viking times. This isn't about raids or battles, though those certainly happened, but about the casual, routine violence that you'd witness regularly if you lived in Norse society. This was a world where violence was a normal means of resolving disputes, establishing hierarchy, and maintaining order. You'd see children beaten regularly. Parents, older siblings, any adult with authority over a child would use physical punishment without hesitation. A child who disobeyed, who failed at a task, who showed disrespect might be struck, slapped, switched with a rod. This wasn't considered abuse. It was considered proper discipline, the only way to teach children their place and their duties. The cries of children being punished would be a common sound, unremarkable. Thralls would be beaten more severely. They were property after all, and owners had essentially unlimited rights over them. A thrall who worked too slowly, who broke something, who showed insufficient deference could be whipped, kicked, struck with whatever implement was handy. Serious infractions might result in mutilation, cutting off fingers or ears as both, punishment and mark of their crime. You'd see people with these mutilations moving through their lives and you'd know what it meant. Fights between free men were also common. Disputes over property, perceived insults, competition for status, all of these could erupt into violence. The Norse had a culture of honour where allowing an insult to pass unanswered marked you as weak, so men fought to preserve their reputations. These fights might be wrestling matches or might involve weapons. People were injured, sometimes killed. The law recognised certain types of violence as legitimate and others as requiring compensation or blood vengeance. But the line between legal and illegal violence was often unclear. What made this truly brutal was the casual nature of it. Violence wasn't shocking, it was ordinary. You'd become accustomed to seeing people hurt, to hearing screams and blows, to bloodshed. Your threshold for what constituted excessive violence would shift. Things that would horrify you initially, a man beating his thrall unconscious, a fight that left someone crippled, would eventually seem like just part of how the world worked. The normalization of violence would change you in ways that might be difficult to recognize, and you might be a victim yourself. If you were a thrall, violence against you was essentially unlimited. If you were a woman, you were vulnerable to sexual violence, especially if you lacked powerful male relatives to protect you. If you were a child, adults could discipline you physically without restraint. Even free men could be drawn into violence through no fault of their own. A feud between families, a drunken argument that escalated, a case of mistaken identity. We can scarcely imagine how the constant threat of violence would affect psychology, creating a baseline of anxiety and wariness that never quite went away. Everything we've discussed so far would be experienced differently depending on your social status in Viking Age society. So let's examine where you might fall in the hierarchy and what that would mean for your daily life. This matters enormously because Norse society was rigidly stratified, in ways that determined almost every aspect of existence. At the top were the Jarls, the nobility who owned large amounts of land, commanded warriors, and exercised political power. If you were born a Jarl, your life would be vastly more comfortable than most. You'd eat better, dress better, live in a larger, more comfortable dwelling. You'd have thralls to do much of the hard labour. You'd have access to imported luxuries, fine weapons, jewellery, exotic foods. But you'd also have responsibilities and dangers, managing your estates, maintaining your fighting force, navigating the complex politics of alliances and rivalries, and facing the physical dangers of warfare and feuds. The middle tier, the carls, were free farmers and craftsmen. This is probably where most people reading this would have fallen if born into Viking society. You'd own or rent land, work it yourself with your family's labour and perhaps a few hired hands or thralls. You'd have legal rights, could participate in the Thing, the local assembly where laws were made and disputes settled, could testify in court, could seek justice if wronged. But your life would still be hard, defined by constant labour, vulnerable to crop failure or illness that could push you into poverty. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves who had no legal rights, or property that could be bought and sold and lived entirely at their owner's mercy. You might be born a thrall, child of thrall parents, or you might have been captured in a raid or sold into slavery to pay debts. Your life would be one of unrelenting labour, minimal compensation, physical abuse, and no hope of improvement except through the kindness of your owner, which couldn't be counted on. You'd sleep in the worst places, eat the worst food, wear the worst clothing, and be blamed for anything that went wrong. What made this social system truly brutal was how absolute it was. Your birth largely determined your entire life trajectory. Yes, there was some mobility. A successful warrior might gain wealth and status. A free farmer might fall into debt and lose everything. But these were exceptions. Most people died in the same social class they were born into. The psychological weight of this must have been enormous. To know that your life was essentially fixed, that you could work as hard as you wanted but couldn't fundamentally change your position. The visible markers of status would be constant reminders. The quality of someone's clothing, the size of their dwelling, the deference shown to them by others, all of this would tell you immediately where they stood and where you stood in relation to them. If you were low status, you'd bow your head, step aside, speak respectfully to those above you. It's hard not to imagine how this affected one's sense of self, how being constantly reminded of your inferiority might shape personality and aspiration. Let's discuss something that historical accounts often gloss over, but that would be a fundamental part of your experience in Viking times: romantic and sexual relationships, intimacy, and the complex dynamics of personal connection in a society very different from ours. If you woke up in Viking times, your options for love and sex would be constrained in ways that might surprise you. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement. Families negotiated matches based on land, alliances, and the transfer of wealth. Love might develop within a marriage, but it wasn't the basis for forming one. Divorce was possible under Norse law for both men and women, but it had to be for legally recognised reasons: impotence, cross-dressing, extreme violence, abandonment. You couldn't simply divorce because you were unhappy or had met someone else. Within marriage, sex was expected to produce children. The Norse valued children highly. They were labour, security in old age, continuation of the family line. Contraception was limited to herbal remedies of uncertain effectiveness and withdrawal, neither of which was reliable. Women spent much of their adult lives pregnant or nursing, which took a serious physical toll. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women died from it, or from complications that developed afterward. For men, sexual access to thralls was essentially unlimited. A male householder could have sex with his female thralls whenever he wished. They had no right to refuse. This was not considered adultery. Children born from these unions were thralls themselves. unless the father chose to acknowledge them, which was rare. For free women, sexual activity outside marriage was supposed to be severely restricted, though how well this was enforced varied. A woman who became pregnant outside marriage might be forced to marry the father, or she might be socially disgraced. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how little privacy surrounded intimacy. Remember, people lived in communal spaces. Married couples didn't have private bedrooms. Sex happened on the sleeping platforms in the longhouse, with other people nearby, possibly hearing or even seeing. This must have been profoundly inhibiting for some, though others perhaps adjusted to it as simply how things were. The sounds of intimacy would be another layer in the nighttime soundscape we discussed earlier. Homosexuality existed in Norse society, though it was complicated. The Norse had strict gender roles and negative views of male receptive homosexuality, which was seen as unmanly. The active partner was less stigmatised, but accusations of being a passive partner, using the term arga or raga, were serious insults that could lead to violence. Lesbian relationships are barely mentioned in surviving sources, likely because women's sexuality was less monitored as long as they fulfilled their reproductive duties. It's hard not to imagine how difficult and frightening it would be to experience same-sex attraction in such a context. Mental health is a modern concept, but the realities it describes, depression, anxiety, trauma, grief, despair, were certainly experienced by people in Viking times, even if they lacked our vocabulary for these conditions. If you woke up in Viking times struggling with mental health challenges, you'd face a world with no therapeutic framework, no medication, and only rudimentary understanding of what you were experiencing. Depression and seasonal affective disorder must have been common, given the long dark winters and the harsh living conditions. But there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no accommodation for someone who couldn't function due to depression. You'd be expected to work regardless of how you felt. If you couldn't work, you'd be seen as lazy or weak, a burden on your family and community. The lack of understanding would be isolating. You wouldn't be able to articulate what was wrong in terms others would recognise or accept. Anxiety would be ever present for many people. The constant threats, violence, starvation, disease, accidents, created a state of perpetual vigilance. Post-traumatic stress from witnessing or experiencing violence, from losing loved ones, from surviving raids or harsh winters would affect many, but there was no framework for recognising or treating it. People might be understood as having been affected by terrible experiences, but the expectation was that you'd simply endure and continue functioning. The Norse did recognise certain mental states. Someone who went berserk in battle was both valued and feared. These were warriors who fought with a fury that seemed to transcend normal human limitations, but they were also dangerous and unpredictable. Madness was recognised when someone's behaviour became too bizarre to ignore, but it was often attributed to curses, angry spirits, or divine displeasure rather than being understood as a medical condition. What made this truly brutal was the complete absence of help. There was nowhere to go, no one trained to listen and help you work through your feelings, no medication that might ease chemical imbalances in your brain. Your family might be sympathetic if you were lucky, but they'd also be frustrated by your inability to contribute. The community had no resources to spare on someone who couldn't work. If your mental state deteriorated enough, you might be seen as cursed or possessed, which would only add supernatural terror to your psychological suffering. So the next time you're able to access mental health support, therapy, medication, or even just friends who understand that mental health is real and important, recognise what a privilege that is. In Viking times, you'd face your psychological demons alone, expected to simply push through, with no language to describe what you were experiencing and no hope of real help. We can scarcely imagine how much suffering this caused, how many people lived their entire lives in psychological pain that went unacknowledged and untreated. After all this discussion of hardship, you might wonder, what did people do for entertainment? If you woke up in Viking times, Your leisure hours would be rare, and your options for filling them quite limited compared to the constant stimulation available in modern life. This matters because how people spend their free time affects quality of life and psychological well-being significantly. The Norse did have forms of entertainment. Storytelling was central. The long nights of winter were filled with sagas and tales, both historical and mythological. These were oral traditions, memorised and passed down, constantly evolving in the retelling. A skilled storyteller was valued, and gatherings would often centre around someone recounting the deeds of ancestors, gods, and heroes. This was education, entertainment, and cultural transmission all at once. Games and sports were popular. Board games like Nefatafel, a strategy game, were played. Wrestling and other physical contests provided both entertainment and a way for men to demonstrate prowess and settle disputes. In winter, ice skating using bone skates was possible in some regions. Dice games and other forms of gambling occurred, though how organised or common these were is unclear from the surviving evidence. Music existed, though we know frustratingly little about what it sounded like. There were simple instruments, flutes, lyres, drums. People sang, both work songs to make labour more bearable, and entertainment songs at gatherings. But there was nothing like the constant background music of modern life. Most of your days would be spent in silence or with only the sounds of work and conversation. What made this truly brutal was the sheer amount of boredom you'd experience. When entertainment was finite and labour was constant, the times when you had nothing required of you and nothing to distract you would be profoundly empty. No books to read, for most people who couldn't read anyway. No screens to stare at, no constant stream of novel stimuli. Just sitting, thinking, existing in the moment. For people accustomed to constant entertainment, this would be almost unbearably tedious. Yet perhaps there was something valuable in this too. The Norse were forced to be present with themselves and with others in ways we've largely lost. Entertainment came from human connection, talking, telling stories, playing games together. Boredom might have been oppressive, but it also left space for thought, for imagination, for genuine engagement with the people around you. It's hard not to wonder whether our constant modern stimulation might actually impoverish our inner lives in ways we don't recognise. Death was far more present in Viking life than in modern society, where we've largely sequestered it away in hospitals and funeral homes. If you woke up in Viking times, you'd live much closer to death, would witness it more often, and would be involved in preparing bodies and burial in ways that might shock modern sensibilities. Let's examine what this proximity to death actually meant. Infant and child mortality was staggeringly high by modern standards. Perhaps a third or more of children died before age 5. Disease, accidents, malnutrition, and complications from illness that would be minor today could be fatal. This meant that most families experienced the death of at least one child, and many experienced multiple losses. You'd see small bodies prepared for burial, would participate in the rituals around their death, would carry this grief while simultaneously continuing with the daily labour of survival. Adults died too, of course, and often suddenly. Accidents during work, complications from minor injuries that became infected, illnesses that progressed rapidly without effective treatment, childbirth for women, violence for men. When someone died, their body would be washed and prepared by family members, tasks that modern people hire professionals to handle. You'd touch the dead, dress them, bind them, arrange them for burial. This intimate contact with death would be disturbing initially, but would become routine. The Norse practiced both burial and cremation, depending on region and period. Bodies might be interred in graves, sometimes in ships or under mounds of earth. Grave goods, weapons, tools, jewellery, sometimes even sacrificed slaves or animals, would accompany the deceased to the afterlife. If you witnessed a major funeral, you'd see wealth being destroyed or buried, a reminder of how seriously the Norse took their obligations to the dead. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how close the dead were to the living. Burial grounds were often near settlements. You'd pass graves regularly, would see the mounds or markers that indicated where the dead lay. In winter, when the ground was too frozen to dig, bodies might be stored above ground until spring, wrapped but still present, a reminder of mortality that you couldn't escape. The boundary between living and dead was much more permeable than it is in modern Western society. The psychological impact of this proximity to death must have been significant. You'd be constantly reminded of your own mortality, would see that life could end at any moment, that death came for rich and poor, young and old, without warning or mercy. This perhaps explains the Norse focus on honour and glory. If death was inevitable, and might come at any time, what mattered was how you lived, whether you'd be remembered, whether your name would survive in stories after your body was gone. Religion was not a separate sphere of life in Viking times, but was woven into every aspect of existence. If you woke up in Viking times, you'd participate in religious rituals and practices that were very different from modern faiths, more transactional and less focused on personal salvation or morality as we understand it. Let's examine what these practices would actually involve. Sacrifice, blot, was the central ritual act. Animals, and according to some sources, occasionally humans, were killed as offerings to the gods. Their blood was sprinkled on altars, on participants, on sacred spaces. The meat was then cooked and consumed in a communal feast. These sacrifices occurred at regular intervals throughout the year, marking seasonal transitions and seeking divine favour for harvests, voyages, or military campaigns. You'd be expected to participate if you were part of the community hosting the blot. This might mean helping to prepare the animal, witnessing the killing, receiving the sprinkled blood on your person, consuming the sacrificed meat. If you had modern sensibilities about animal slaughter or vegetarianism, you'd have no way to opt out without serious social consequences. Refusing to participate in communal religious rites marked you as outside the community, potentially dangerous, certainly suspect. Smaller private rituals would also be part of your life, offerings at household shrines, prayers to specific gods for specific needs, charms and amulets worn for protection. The boundary between religion and magic was unclear. Both involved appealing to supernatural forces for practical ends. You might consult a Völva, a female seer who performed a type of shamanic ritual called Seder, if you needed to know the future or influence fate. This involved ritual acts that male participation in was considered unmanly, creating interesting gender dynamics around spiritual power. What made these practices truly strange from a modern perspective was their transactional nature. You sacrificed to the gods not out of love or worship, but as part of an exchange. You gave them honour and offerings, they gave you favour and protection. If the gods failed to deliver, you might turn to different gods or intensify your offerings. There was no concept of faith as belief without evidence. The gods either helped you or they didn't, and the rituals either worked or they didn't. The coming of Christianity, which was happening in parts of Scandinavia during the later Viking Age, created tension and conflict. Some people converted genuinely, others hedged their bets by honouring both the old gods and Christ, others resisted Christianity violently. If you found yourself in this transitional period, you'd witness religious violence, forced conversions, the destruction of sacred sites. It's hard not to feel how destabilising this must have been, to have the religious framework that had structured life for generations suddenly challenged and dismantled. Let's focus more closely on one aspect of Norse religion that particularly challenges modern sensibilities, the practice of sacrifice, including the evidence for human sacrifice. This is disturbing material, but understanding it is important for grasping just how different Viking Age values were from our own. If you woke up in Viking times, you might witness or even participate in practices that would seem horrifying to modern ethics. Animal sacrifice was routine, as mentioned earlier. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, dogs, all might be sacrificed depending on the importance of the occasion and the gods being honoured. The killings were ritualised, done according to specific procedures, but they were still killings. Blood, viscera, the sounds and smells of death. All of this was part of religious practice. Children would grow up witnessing these acts, becoming inured to violence in a way that shaped their entire worldview. Human sacrifice is more controversial and less well documented, but there's enough evidence to suggest it did occur, at least occasionally. The Norse sagas mention it, though these were written down long after the fact and may be exaggerated or misremembered. Archaeological evidence provides some support, bodies found, in ways suggesting ritual killing, though interpretation is often debated. Adam of Bremen, a Christian chronicler, describes a temple at Uppsala where human sacrifices occurred every 9 years, though his account may be biased or exaggerated. If human sacrifice did occur, who would be sacrificed? Likely thralls in most cases, the least valued members of society, whose lives could be ended without the social disruption that killing a free person would cause. The sagas mention thralls being killed to accompany their masters to the afterlife, essentially continuing to serve even in death. Imagine being a thrall and knowing that your life might end not from natural causes, but because someone of higher status died and you were selected to go with them. What made this truly brutal was the absoluteness of it. If you were selected for sacrifice, there was no appeal, no escape. Your community would see your death as necessary, even holy. The people who killed you would feel they were performing a sacred duty. Your suffering would have religious meaning, would be seen as serving the greater good. The total lack of individual rights, the way a person could be reduced to a sacrificial object, is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of Norse society for modern people to comprehend. The psychological impact on everyone involved should not be underestimated. Knowing that human life could be deliberately ended for religious purposes, that this was acceptable and even necessary according to your culture's beliefs, how would that affect your sense of human value, of your own value? If you were low status, the knowledge that you might be sacrificed must have created a constant background fear. If you were higher status, participating in or witnessing human sacrifice would shape your understanding of power and religion in profound ways. The Norse relationship with death was unique. They believed in an afterlife, but not in the sense of eternal paradise or damnation, as Christianity taught. If you woke up in Viking times, your entire life would be shaped by the understanding that death was not an ending but a transition, and how you died and were buried mattered enormously. Let's examine what this meant practically and psychologically. The concept of a good death was central. Dying in battle was ideal, as this meant you might be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to go to Valhalla, where you'd feast and fight until Ragnarok. Dying of old age or illness wasn't shameful, but it didn't carry the same glory. This created interesting incentives. Old or dying men might seek out combat specifically to achieve a better afterlife. The sagas record instances of people effectively choosing how they die to influence their afterlife destiny. Burial goods were important because the Norse believed you'd need them in the afterlife. Your grave might contain weapons, tools, jewellery, food, even sacrificed animals or slaves. The wealth buried with you was wealth lost to your living descendants. But they'd provide it anyway because proper treatment of the dead was a sacred obligation. If you died, you'd want to know your family would honour you this way. If family members died, you'd be expected to impoverish yourself if necessary to give them proper burial. The various afterlife destinations created a complex geography of death. Warriors might go to Valhalla, or to Freya's Hall, Folkvanga. Those who died at sea might go to the goddess Ran's Hall. Many seemed to simply go to Hell, the realm of the goddess Hell, which wasn't a place of punishment but just where dead people went. The vagueness and contradictions in surviving accounts suggest the Norse themselves weren't entirely sure or agreed on the details. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the Norse concept of draugr, undead beings that might arise if burial wasn't done properly, or if the deceased had been particularly evil or powerful in life. These weren't shambling zombies, but intelligent, dangerous entities with the ability to harm the living. Fear of the dead, of improper burial leading to hauntings or worse, was real, and motivated careful attention to funeral rites. You'd participate in these rites not just out of love or respect, but out of genuine fear of what might happen if you got it wrong. So the next time you think about death in abstract terms, remember that the Norse lived with it concretely, as a constant presence and future reality that shaped how they conducted their entire lives. The way they prepared for death, thought about death, incorporated death into their worldview, was radically different from modern approaches that try to sanitize and distance death as much as possible. We can scarcely imagine what it would be like to live with that kind of constant awareness of mortality. We've mentioned thralls, slaves, repeatedly, but their condition was so central to Viking society, and so profoundly different from any modern status, that it deserves focused attention. If you woke up in Viking times as a thrall, your life would be one of unrelenting hardship, indignity, and danger, with essentially no hope of escape. Let's examine what this would actually mean day to day. You'd have been born a thrall, child of thrall parents, or captured in a raid and sold, or sold yourself or been sold by family to pay debts. However you became a thrall, you were now property. Your owner could buy, sell, trade, lend, or give you away. You could be used as payment for debts, split up from family members if your owner chose to divide their property. You had no say in your fate, no ability to appeal to higher authority, because there was no authority that recognised your personhood. Your living conditions would be the worst in the household. You'd sleep in the coldest, least comfortable spots, perhaps even in the section of the longhouse where animals were kept. Your food would be whatever was left after everyone else ate, the scraps, the damaged or spoiled portions, the coarsest bread. Your clothing would be rough, patched, inadequate for the weather. You'd be cold and hungry most of the time, but complaining would only bring punishment. The work would be backbreaking and constant. You'd be assigned the hardest, dirtiest tasks, mucking out animal pens, hauling water and firewood, processing waste, slaughtering animals, digging, lifting, carrying. You'd work from before dawn until after dark, and if you worked too slowly or made mistakes, you'd be beaten. There were no days off, no limit to what could be demanded of you. Your body would break down from the constant strain, but there was no retirement for thralls. You worked until you died, or became too incapacitated to work, at which point you might be killed or simply turned out to die of exposure. What made this truly brutal was the sexual exploitation. Female thralls were sexually available to their owners, and to any free man the owner allowed access. You couldn't refuse. If you became pregnant, the child would be a thrall too, and you'd have to continue working throughout pregnancy and shortly after birth. Male thralls could be castrated if their owners wished, removing the possibility of reproduction and creating a more docile worker. The physical mutilation and sexual violence that thralls endured was simply accepted as part of what thralldom meant. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical. You'd be constantly reminded of your subhuman status. Free people would speak about you as if you weren't there, would mock you, would blame you for anything that went wrong, whether you were responsible or not. You'd have no defence, no way to assert dignity or worth. The constant degradation, the knowledge that you were seen as fundamentally less than human, would erode your sense of self in ways that might be impossible to resist. It's hard not to imagine how many thralls simply gave up, existing in a state of numb compliance because resistance was pointless, and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Gender roles in Viking Age society were rigid and comprehensive, shaping every aspect of life in ways that modern people might find both familiar and alien. If you woke up in Viking times, your experience would be profoundly different depending on whether you were male or female, and the restrictions and expectations placed on you would be inescapable. Let's examine what this actually meant. Men's primary sphere was the public world. They fought, traded, attended the thing, the assembly where law and politics happened, owned and managed property. A man's worth was measured in his ability to support his household, defend his honour, and participate effectively in the masculine domains of violence and law. Weakness was shameful. A man who couldn't protect his family, who avoided conflict, who showed too much interest in traditionally female activities, risked being called aga, an insult that impugned his masculinity so severely that it could legally justify violence in response. Women's primary sphere was the household. They managed domestic production, which was actually enormously important economically. Textile production alone represented a huge portion of a household's wealth. Women had legal rights unusual for medieval Europe. They could own property, inherit, divorce under certain circumstances, manage the household's affairs during their husband's absence. But they were also excluded from combat, generally, from full participation in legal proceedings, from the public honour culture that was so central to male identity. The sexual double standard was profound. A man could have sex with his female thralls without social consequence. A married man who had sex with another man's wife could be killed legally by the wronged husband, but the wronged husband wasn't required to do so. A woman who had sex outside marriage, however, faced severe consequences, at minimum social disgrace, potentially violence from her family, dissolution of her marriage. Women's sexuality was controlled in ways men's was not, because paternity had to be certain for the inheritance system to function. What made this truly brutal was how the gender system trapped everyone. Men who didn't fit the warrior ideal suffered. Those who were gentle, scholarly, interested in traditionally female crafts, or who simply weren't good at violence. They had to perform masculinity anyway, or face social exclusion and legal vulnerability. Women who were ambitious, aggressive, or interested in male domains had few outlets, and were often suspected of witchcraft if they were too successful or unconventional. The system was rigid enough that individual variance was punished, but flexible enough that exceptions existed. Shield maidens in the sagas, though how historical these were is debated. Male Seder practitioners despite the practice being seen as unmanly. The psychological weight of these gender restrictions shouldn't be underestimated. You'd internalise them from childhood, would be constantly reinforcing them in your behaviour and monitoring them in others. The performance of gender would be continuous and exhausting, and yet for most people it would simply seem natural, the way things were, not something to be questioned or resisted. It's hard not to reflect on how much of what we think of as natural or inevitable about gender is actually cultural construction, variable across time and place, rather than fixed in biology. Children in Viking times were valued, but their experience of childhood was radically different from modern notions of innocence, protection, and education. If you woke up in Viking times as a child, or had children of your own, the realities of childhood would be sobering. Let's examine what it meant to be young in Norse society. Children were expected to begin working as soon as they were physically capable. Small children might gather kindling, watch younger siblings, collect eggs, simple tasks that contributed to the household. By age 7 or 8, children were doing significant labour. Boys helping with herding and field work, girls spinning and helping with food preparation. By puberty, they were doing essentially adult work, just less of it. There was no extended period of education or play. Childhood was brief, and the transition to adult responsibilities came early. The mortality rate was staggering. As mentioned earlier, perhaps a third or more of children died before age 5. Common childhood illnesses that are now minor could be fatal. Accidents were common. Children falling into fires, drowning, being kicked by animals, injuring themselves with tools. Parents had many children partly because they expected to lose several. The emotional calculus was different. You loved your children, but also maintained some psychological distance, because attachment to someone who would probably die was emotionally dangerous. Discipline was physical and harsh. Children who misbehaved were struck, sometimes severely. This wasn't considered abuse, but proper parenting. Children learned through experience, including painful experience, what was acceptable and what wasn't. There was no concept of preserving childhood innocence. Children witnessed sex, violence, death, slaughter, all the harsh realities of life. They were expected to toughen up, to accept that the world was dangerous and difficult, to prepare themselves for adult responsibilities. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how vulnerable children were to violence from outside the family. Thrall children could be abused by anyone in the household. In times of famine, infant exposure was practiced. Unwanted babies, especially girls or those born with disabilities, might be left outside to die. During raids, children might be killed or taken as slaves. The Norse valued their own children but felt little compunction about harming others' children. The concept of children as a protected class with special rights simply didn't exist. The education children received was practical and informal. Boys learned by working alongside their fathers, girls alongside their mothers. Some children, particularly those in wealthy families, might learn poetry, law, or other specialised knowledge. But formal schooling didn't exist for most. Literacy was rare, limited to runes which were used more for marking ownership and religious purposes than for literature. Most children grew up unable to read or write, learning what they needed to know for their expected adult roles and nothing more. Everything we've discussed so far describes the baseline of Viking life. Difficult, harsh, but survivable if you were fortunate. But the baseline wasn't guaranteed. If you woke up in Viking times, you'd also face the possibility of things getting dramatically worse through famine, raids, disease, or particularly brutal winters. Let's examine what happened when the already precarious balance of survival tipped toward disaster. Famine could strike for various reasons. Crop failure from cold, wet summers, livestock disease, raids that destroyed stores or killed animals. When food ran short, people didn't simply go hungry. They faced starvation that killed slowly and brutally. Children and the elderly would die first, then the weak and sick, then everyone else if the famine continued. You'd watch your family members waste away, their bodies consuming themselves, their minds becoming confused, their spirits breaking. And you'd be powerless to stop it because there simply wasn't enough food. Raids brought sudden violence. If a raiding party attacked your settlement, you might be killed defending it, or captured and enslaved, or watch your loved ones killed or taken. Your possessions would be looted, your animals driven off, your buildings burned. Even if you survived, you'd face the prospect of rebuilding from nothing. The psychological trauma of such an attack, the violation of your home and the loss of security, would be profound. And you'd know it could happen again at any time. Disease could sweep through communities with devastating speed. With no understanding of contagion, no effective treatments, no quarantine procedures, epidemics killed large portions of the population. You'd watch people sicken and die one after another and know you might be next. The randomness of it, why some survived and others died, would be terrifying. The gods were angry, clearly, but what had you done to deserve this? Or if you survived while loved ones died, the guilt and grief would be overwhelming. Particularly harsh winters could kill through cold and isolation. If you were trapped in your dwelling by snow for weeks, your food running low, your firewood dwindling, the darkness and cold pressing in, you'd face a test of endurance that some wouldn't pass. People froze to death. Others went mad from the confinement and darkness. Families turned on each other as stress and fear and hunger eroded bonds of affection. The spring would find fewer people alive than the autumn had seen. What made these disasters truly brutal was how common they were. They weren't rare, exceptional events, but regular occurrences that everyone expected to face multiple times in their life. The baseline of a Norse existence was difficult, but the regular catastrophes that punched down below that baseline were what really defined life's precariousness. You lived knowing that at any time things could get much worse, and when they did, survival was not guaranteed no matter how strong or clever you were. We can scarcely imagine living with that level of existential vulnerability, how it would shape every decision, every relationship, every moment of peace or happiness. So we've spent considerable time together tonight, you and I, exploring what it would mean to wake up in Viking times. We've examined the physical environment, the darkness, the cold, the smells and sounds that would assault senses accustomed to modern comfort. We've looked at daily survival, the constant labour required just to maintain existence, the food that never quite satisfied, the water that had to be carried, the bathroom situation that challenged dignity. We've confronted the violence, the rigid social hierarchy, the proximity to death, the religious practices that seem so foreign to modern sensibilities. It's been a long journey, and if you're still here with me, I'm grateful for your attention. This has been a dark tour in many ways. Viking life, stripped of romantic fantasy, was brutal in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. The discomfort was constant. The danger was real. The lack of options, of mobility, of hope for fundamental change would be psychologically crushing. And yet, millions of people lived these lives, endured these hardships, found meaning and joy where they could, loved their children, took pride in their work, told stories, laughed, celebrated. Perhaps that's the most important takeaway from all of this. Human resilience is extraordinary. People adapt to circumstances that seem unbearable, find ways to construct meaning and identity even in the most restrictive conditions, create culture and beauty even in the midst of hardship. The Norse weren't constantly miserable, despite everything we've discussed. They had their own normality, their own sources of satisfaction, their own ways of understanding a good life. We can look back and see only suffering, but they looked around and saw simply life. But let's not romanticize that resilience too much either. Let's pause here, because there's more to consider. The fact that humans can adapt to terrible conditions doesn't mean those conditions were acceptable. The modern improvements we've discussed, clean water, sanitation, medical care, protection from violence, freedom from slavery, some measure of social mobility, these aren't luxuries or signs of weakness. They are achievements that represent real increases in human dignity and well-being. The Norse made do with what they had because they had no choice. We have choices, and we should appreciate them. Think about your own life for a moment. The aspects we take for granted: privacy, comfort, the ability to pursue interests beyond mere survival, protection from violence, access to information, control over our own bodies and futures. All of this would have been unimaginable to someone in Viking times. We're not better people than they were. We're not stronger or more deserving. We're simply fortunate to live in a time and place where technological and social development have created conditions that allow for lives of less suffering and more possibility. The gap between their world and ours should humble us. It should make us grateful. It should also make us thoughtful about those in our own time who still live in conditions closer to the Viking baseline. People without clean water, adequate food, safety, dignity. The fact that we can imagine what Viking life was like and recoil from it should inform our response to modern poverty and oppression. If we wouldn't want to wake up in Viking times, why would we accept similar conditions for others living now? Let's reflect a bit more before we part ways. There's a tendency in modern culture to romanticize the past, to imagine that life was simpler and perhaps better before modernity complicated everything. These journeys we take together into history serve as antidotes to that nostalgia. The past wasn't simple, it was simply different and often brutally so. Life wasn't better, it was harder in almost every measurable way. What we lose in modernity, perhaps some sense of community, some connection to nature, some clarity of purpose, is far outweighed by what we gain in comfort, health, and possibility. But we shouldn't be smug about this either. Future generations, if humanity survives and continues to develop, will look back at our time the way we look back at the Vikings. They'll see suffering and limitations that we can't perceive because we're immersed in them. They'll wonder how we tolerated things that seem normal to us. The arc of human development, to the extent it has direction, seems to bend toward expanding circles of moral concern and improving material conditions. But we're not at the end of that process. We're in the middle, just as the Vikings were, doing the best we can with what we know and have. I find something both sad and inspiring in that. Sad because it means our own lives, for all that they're easier than the Vikings, still contain unnecessary suffering that future generations will find appalling. Inspiring because it means progress is possible, that the conditions of human life aren't fixed, that we can imagine and work toward better futures even if we won't live to see them fully realised. We're winding down now, getting ready to let you drift off. I hope this journey has given you something to think about. Maybe a greater appreciation for your own circumstances. Maybe a deeper understanding of how profoundly time and place shape human experience. Maybe just a long, detailed, somewhat boring exploration of history that helped your mind slow down and prepare for sleep. Whatever you take from this, I'm glad we made this journey together. The Vikings are long gone now. Their longhouses have returned to Earth. The people who experienced everything we've discussed tonight died centuries ago. Their struggles are over. Their pain has ended. The world they knew has been transformed so completely that even the landscape they knew is almost unrecognisable. Time erases everything eventually, softens all suffering, renders even the most dramatic events into stories and then into forgetting. There's comfort in that, I think. Whatever struggles you're facing in your own life, whatever discomforts or fears or frustrations, they too will pass. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Time moves on. Conditions change. What seems permanent is actually temporary. The Vikings knew this in their bones. Their concept of fate, of word, included the understanding that nothing lasts, that all things pass away. It's a melancholy wisdom, but a true one. So let's end here, at the end of this long exploration, with gratitude for the lives we have, compassion for those who came before us and struggled in ways we can barely imagine, and hope for those who will come after us and who will, hopefully, look back at our time with the same mixture of horror and sympathy that we've directed tonight toward the Viking Age. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. If you found value in this, if it helped you relax or think or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing to the channel. Consider sharing this with someone else who might appreciate these long, meandering, slightly melancholic explorations of history. Consider leaving a comment about what aspects of Viking life surprised you most, what you'd like to explore next, or just to let me know you were here. Rest well, wherever you are. Sleep peacefully, in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, in your safe home. You've earned these comforts simply by having been born in a time and place that makes them possible. The Vikings would envy you if they could know what your life is like. But they can't know, because they're gone, and you're here, and the present is always the only place any of us truly inhabits. Sweet dreams, dear listener. Until next time, when we'll explore some other forgotten corner of the past together, I wish you peace and rest and the gentle embrace of sleep. Good night.